We are at the beginning of the 20th century. When we looked at the Navy, trade routes, industrial power, and global colonial map of the most powerful empire in the world, there was an unsettling truth. Coal had built the British Empire, but it might not be enough to sustain it. The next war would not be only about ships, land, and manpower. It would be about fuel. It would be about speed, about supply chains. It would be about whether a state could move its modern machines fast enough, far enough, and long enough, while weakening or destroying the enemy before its own system collapsed. At this point, World War I was not only the last great imperial war of the Old World, but also the first global war of oil. Welcome to the dark history of finance, where money, gold, power, and history collide, and nothing is as simple and easy as it seems. To better understand why oil was so important, we must go back to the period just before the war, when the world still ran its technology on coal. Coal powered factories, railways, trade fleets, and the great warships of the time. Britain had abundant coal reserves in its depots, and this was one of the main reasons it dominated the 19th century. However, oil had advantages that coal did not. Oil carried more energy per unit of weight, could be transported faster, provided acceleration, required fewer workers shoveling coal into furnaces, and gave warships a speed, operational ease, and flexibility that coal-powered fleets struggled to achieve. Winston Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, shifted the Royal Navy toward oil, despite Britain not having a comfortable domestic oil source like coal. By 1914, Parliament approved state investment in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company to secure the Navy's fuel supply. The British state took a controlling stake and directly tied its strategy to oil. This was not a minor issue. It was the state openly acknowledging that energy had become a matter of national security. And this is where the real story begins. Because when a navy, army, or economy reorganizes itself around a new energy source, it is no longer just buying fuel. It is reshaping its foreign policy. It changes which territories matter more, which companies are significant, which sea routes are critical, and which distant crises suddenly become vital. A pipeline in Iran, an oil terminal near the Gulf, or a field around Basra was now becoming as important to London as a shipyard in Portsmouth. Oil turned geography into a strategy operating at industrial speed. It made distant places feel dangerously close. This became one of the hidden rules of modern power. Resources do not remain local once empires become dependent on them. First, they become political, then military, and then, if governments prefer a softer expression, moral. When war broke out in August 1914, Europe still appeared at first glance to be a continent fighting with railways, horses, artillery, and soldiers wearing uniforms from the previous century. And in many ways, it was. Railways were the backbone of mobilization. Horse transport was still vital. Aviation was in its infancy. Tanks would only appear on the battlefield in 1916. But beneath the surface, the character of war had already begun to change. Trucks, tanks, cars, submarines, and aircraft all depended on oil-based fuels. Mobility, range, and mechanical warfare were no longer dreams of the future. They were becoming real, messy, unreliable, and fuel-hungry realities. The war mostly began in a world of coal and railways, but coal ended in a world that had already clearly seen the future, and that future smelled like oil. This gave the Allied powers a major advantage. Controlling more than 70% of global oil production, the Allies held a decisive superiority. Because wars are not won only by tactics and genius, wars are won by systems that can feed machines, transport ammunition, move soldiers, and replace losses. Oil did not replace everything in World War I, but it increasingly determined which side could use new forms of mobility and which side would be constrained by scarcity. The Allies were not magically smarter or more tactical. They were simply better positioned in the energy economy that modern warfare was beginning to require. And history often becomes ruthless in exactly this way. The side with the better moral narrative is not always the side with better logistics. But the side with better logistics usually becomes the one that writes the peace conference. Britain understood this even earlier in the Middle East. When the Ottoman Empire entered the war in late 1914, British leaders quickly moved into Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. The official reason was clear: to protect the valuable oil fields near Basra. British and Indian forces landed in November 1914 and captured Basra and then Kurna. This matters because it strips away emotional myths about war aims. Before slogans, rhetoric, and later justifications, there is a hard strategic calculation. If oil is important for the Navy in war, then the routes leading to Gulf oil become even more important. Suddenly, Mesopotamia was no longer a peripheral region. It had become tied to the survival of the empire. Meanwhile, the Central Powers were experiencing the opposite. Austria-Hungary had oil reserves in Galicia, but they were insufficient and dangerously close to Russian military pressure. The Ottoman Empire had potential in Mesopotamia and the Arabian Peninsula, but it could not develop these resources at a scale that could change the course of the war. Romania's oil production was slightly higher than Austria-Hungary's and had been tied to German demand before 1914, making the region strategically explosive. Oil scarcity did not leave the Central Powers completely helpless, but it made them fragile in an area that modern war punished ruthlessly: sustainable mechanical capacity. Lack of fuel meant fewer options, slower movement, narrower operations. This was never a comfortable model. This pressure explains why seemingly secondary fronts became so important. In the Caucasus, Ottoman objectives included the oil fields of Baku in Azerbaijan. For Britain, capturing Baku was one of the most strategic and important goals on that front. Baku mattered because it was one of the largest oil centers of the time. Whoever held it would control not only territory, but also industrial potential. That is why those who imagine World War I only as mud, trenches, and the Western Front miss the larger truth. The war was spreading across an emerging energy map. The struggle for oil was not always in the headlines, but it was often embedded within the strategic logic of campaigns. Beneath the language of prestige and defense was a colder question: who would fuel the machines of the new century? Romania made this point even clearer. When it entered the war on the Allied side in 1916, its oil became both a prize and a risk. As the military situation worsened, retreating Romanian forces and their allies completely destroyed oil infrastructure to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. After the Treaty of Bucharest in 1918, the Central Powers established de facto control over Romanian oil fields. The phrase de facto control may sound bureaucratic and harmless, but control over fuel in war is control over logistics. And control over logistics is often control over initiative. Modern warfare was instantly teaching that energy infrastructure could be as strategic as armies. The same logic appeared in weapons that became symbols of the war. Tanks first appeared in September 1916 at the Somme. They were unreliable, clumsy, and few in number. But that misses the point. Their mere existence showed that the industrial logic of war was changing. Tanks were a mechanical answer to trench stalemate. Mechanical solutions required fuel. So did aircraft. And where railways ended, trucks carried supplies. World War I, as an organization, still partly belonged to the 19th century, but its breaking points increasingly depended on 20th century energy. The battlefield was becoming a place where barrels of oil silently turned into mobility, reconnaissance, endurance, and power. You did not always see oil, but you saw what it made possible. By 1918, the picture was clear. Baku had briefly been occupied by Ottoman forces. Romanian oil had temporarily fallen under central influence. Mesopotamia had become deeply tied to British war aims. Oil had transformed from a strategic supplement into a strategic necessity. The side that could secure, transport, and protect oil gained an advantage in the most critical dimensions of modern warfare. This did not mean oil alone won the war, but it played a crucial role in determining who better managed the transition from industrial war to mechanized war. Oil did not replace manpower, steel, finance, or command. It connected them. That is why the phrase, "the hidden war for oil," is so important. It was hidden not because oil was unknown, of course it was known, but because it existed beneath the publicly stated reasons. Governments spoke of alliances, honor, and balance, but underneath lay energy dependency and supply concerns. The relationship between modern states and energy companies hardened further during World War I. Britain's control of Anglo-Persian oil in 1914 blurred the line between public power and private extraction even more. This was not just an investment, it was the state ensuring access to a strategic resource through a commercial structure. From this point on, markets ceased to be just markets. They became extensions of politics. The lesson the war taught was clear. Oil became one of the fundamental pillars of modern sovereignty. Today, the names and technology have changed, but the structure has not. States still shape their foreign policies around critical resources. At a personal level, the same lesson applies. Most people think wars are won by courage on the battlefield, but systems are often determined by quieter factors. Who has oil? Who has logistics and supply? Who is more dependent on a fragile system? Real wealth is the ability to keep functioning even when systems are under stress or collapse entirely. World War I is often remembered as the catastrophe of trenches. But upon closer examination, it is also a turning point in economic history, the most important recent moment when the transition from the coal age to the oil age accelerated. The final lesson is simple but unsettling. Those who dominate an era are usually the ones who understand the next strategic resource before everyone else, and act on it. History does not repeat itself, but if you fail to understand it, it will crush you in every possible way. If this video added value to you, please don't forget to like and follow. See you in the next video.